Part of making sure your website is accessible is making sure that someone can understand your website, no matter what language they've set their default to, even if you aren't specifically creating content in different languages. There's also localization, which is the process of making sure that the content that you're showing on your page is specific to the different languages and cultures that are viewing it. And that usually happens after a website has been developed. Internationalization ensures that a website is prepared for the browser to translate a website and for that localization process. And it's not just that a site can be translated, but that it's still usable when it's translated. All of the things that we do to make sure that people can understand and use our websites, like creating predictable user experiences, apply to a website, whether it's in the original language or translated to a different one. Now, in terms of accessibility requirements, there are 2 WCAG success criteria specifically related to internationalization. There's 3.1.1, which is language of page, and 3.1.2, which is language of parts. And so that refers to the website as a whole, and then any individual pieces within that website. These are the most basic levels of configuration for your website that enable your visitors to access your content. Everything on your website will need to be displayed properly according to your website platform's documentation. For WordPress internationalization, for example, there's a set of functions for themes and plugins to use to display any hard-coded text and user-entered text to make sure that it's properly translated. And there are a few different categories when it comes to the different strategies for making sure that your content is ready to be translated. So first up is HTML and content-based strategies. These are the basic building blocks for your website, and they're what gets added or changed the most on your website. For HTML tags, you have the lang attribute. The main HTML tag of your page should define the language that it's written in. And if you're using some kind of language switcher, that should also change the HTML lang tag. This helps browsers that provide visitors the option to automatically translate content that's in a different language. And it also helps with screen reader pronunciation rules and Braille display. And if your overall page content is in one language and then you're writing some content in another language within that page, unless it's a commonly used word in that main language, any text that's in the different language should be wrapped in an element that has its own lang attribute. This allows those assistive technologies to switch between the appropriate languages and voices at the right times. For example, rendezvous doesn't need to be defined on an English website as French because it's a commonly used word, but something that is fully in Spanish or French that is not common would then need that lang attribute. There are some bookmarklets that will tell you at a glance what lang tags are being used across the site. The one I'm going to show you is from one of the bookmark collections that I shared in the bookmarklet episode of the Accessibility Testing Tools series, and I'll link to that page below. So if we head over to the browser for an example, I have a page here that is in English for the US audience. It is written in English, and then I do have a Spanish phrase on the page as a heading. If I click on the bookmarklet, it will give me a little pop-up where it gives me the information about the tags that are being used that have lang attributes. You have the page lang attribute is en-us, HTML tag has en-us, and then I have an h2 tag that has es. And if we take a look at an example of this same page without that Spanish heading in it, and we click on the bookmarklet, it's going to show us that the page lang attribute is en-us and HTML tag has en-us, but it's not going to show us that any other piece of the site has any other kind of lang attributes because it doesn't exist. This highlighted text that's on the screen right now is actually a code snippet. And so anything that's inside of a code snippet isn't going to be read as actual text to any kind of browser, screen reader, etc. There's also a way to tell the browser that a link that you're sharing has a page in a different language. If you're linking to any kind of document or website that's in a different language, you can identify that with an hreflang attribute. And if you're using a different language than the link text, you can then combine hreflang and lang. Now that last point is usually if you're providing a document in different languages, and so you use the phrase download the English version, and then you use download the Spanish version, but you're using that phrase in Spanish, you can combine the href lang and the lang attributes to let the browser know that the phrase is in a different language and that the content that you're linking to is in a different language as well. We also have to take forms into consideration for internationalization. It's really tempting to use fields and force formatting that make it easier to fill out. But unfortunately, a lot of these types of things end up making it harder and more confusing. And this is especially true when it comes to internationalization. So for example, requiring a minimum or maximum character count, or even disallowing certain characters on a name field, could end up making it impossible for someone to enter their name correctly. And if you're planning on catering to multiple countries, things like phone numbers and addresses have different formats and terminology depending on the country. Aside from them being much less accessible by default, text inside an image is also not translatable by the browser. And that includes SVGs as well. Depending on the browser and how an SVG is configured, it's not going to be translated, especially if it's being animated in some way. Then there's the infamous date formatting. It's really important to be as clear as possible when talking about dates. So use the most understandable format as possible. So for example, you have M/D/Y, right? You have, month, day, year. But that can also be confused for day/month/year. So March the 2nd could be confused as February the 3rd. So if you write out the month, which then also makes it a lot more easily translated, you then avoid the situation where not only could the date formatting be misunderstood, but now it's actually being translated as well. And then if you find yourself needing to use ARIA label, you'll need to take extra care since it doesn't always auto-translate. Our next category is design strategies. So we have word length and line breaks. Make sure that your designs are flexible enough to accommodate different word lengths without breaking out of the container. This is important for things like card layouts where line length can be limited or height can be limited, but it's also relevant for things like navigation. You're going to want to test out how different word lengths affect the layout of the page. This is true for any kind of design, whether you're designing all in one language or you're considering internationalization. So for example, if you're designing for a blog page and you're using the card layout, you have to make sure that different title lengths, whether it's a few words or, a pretty decent, 10 or more words, you have to make sure that any kind of title length is going to look good in that space. And then the same for navigation. If somebody wants to add or remove a page at that top navigation, it does become tricky when it comes to making sure that if the words do have to wrap, that they look good and that they're still, readable and usable, and that the navigation does break at the right time so that things aren't wrapping too much. So this is all just good design principles anyway, but it's especially important for internationalization. Buttons are especially important as well. For languages that end up with shorter word lengths or use symbols, setting a minimum width for buttons ensures that the minimum size for your clickable elements is hit, but usually the minimum size is pretty small. So instead of setting a minimum width of 44 pixels as the default, consider what looks best in your design and communicate those requirements to any kind of development team. And then when a button ends up with a longer word or phrase, you're going to want to make sure that those buttons are designed to have those words wrap properly and that it still looks like a button. Typography is also really important. It can get kind of tricky if you're not specifically designing for multiple languages, but font family, font size, and line height are all relevant to internationalization. It's important that your font choices do include all of the characters that are going to be needed to support any targeted additional languages, but the line height should accommodate accents and other type of characters too, in case the page does get translated by somebody's automatic browser settings. Some languages render fonts smaller than others, and then so that's why minimum font size is also important. And then lastly, we have gradient overlays. So if your design uses a gradient over an image and it goes sort of from one side to another or from top to bottom to make the text more readable, you have to make sure that that gradient changes when the direction of the text changes as well. So some people will be reading in a language that goes right to left instead of left to right or top to bottom. And then when that gradient direction changes, that could end up causing the main part of your image to be covered by the gradient. So you just want to keep these things in mind when you're designing these types of elements. And then we have technical strategies. Everything so far can be considered a technical strategy, especially when we're talking about the things like lang tags and implementing minimum button widths. But something specifically developer related is using the proper spacing. The direction of languages change, which means elements on the page could end up in a different configuration from your original order. So using the correct type of margin and padding definitions will ensure that these shifts in layout keep the correct spacing around and between elements. So you're going to want to use logical instead of directional properties. So for example, use text align end instead of text align right. So if you do plan on sharing your website with an audience that speaks more than one language, it's going to be incredibly beneficial to manually translate your content rather than rely on the browser's automatic translation. And the same advice applies when you're adding a language switcher to your site. If you rely on automatic translation, there's going to be errors and things that will absolutely get lost in translation. Our ultimate goal is to create a website that can be used under as many different circumstances as possible. And we can't predict what someone's first language is. We're trying not to throw up unintentional roadblocks, and internationalization is going to go a long way towards that.